On this episode of the PM podcast, small formats, big questions, and a visit to a chip shop. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Photography News podcast. This is our 37th. My name is Roger Payne and I'm the editorial director at Photography News. And in light of the popularity of the online word game Wordle, I thought I'd introduce my two colleagues and ask them to sum themselves up using a 5-letter word. So, without further ado, welcome to contributing editor, Mr. Kingsley Singleton. Hi, Kingsley.
Hi, 5-letter word. Hi, hello, Will as well. Hello, everybody who's listening. 5-letter word.
Sum yourself up in a 5-letter word. I've put you on the spot, admittedly. Will is now furiously scribbling away, trying to come up with something.
The first one I thought of was cakes, because I had a nice iced finger earlier. And the second one I thought of was one of my pet hates is reading forums when people spell lens with an E on the end of it. So that'll be my non-real word 5-letter word.
So for the duration of this podcast, you'll be known as Mr. Cakes.
Yeah,
welcome.
or Mr. Lenzy.
Mr. Lenzy. And welcome also to editor of Photography News, Mr. Will Chung. Hi, Will.
Hi, Rog. Hi, Kingsley. How are we doing? Okay.
We're both well. So sum yourself up in a 5-letter word, Will.
The first one that came to mind, and you can't really use this, Rog, to call me up during the pod, but the first one that came into my mind was idiot. Because I did something stupid earlier, and I'm not going to even tell you about it because I was just so stupid. I couldn't believe I did it. Anyway, so that was the one word that came to mind. I can't think of any other at the moment. I mean, I'm out to office, guys. What do you think I should be called with 5 letters other than idiot?
You could have had photo. How about that?
Photo, yeah. Well, chill was the other one because I'm chill at the moment, as in darn cold.
But we'll go with cakes and idiot. That's quite good. I quite like that for the duration of the pod. So, Cakes, what have you been photographing since we last got?
Hang on a minute. You're not getting out of this. What's your 5-letter word?
Well, I've photo.
Oh, okay.
There we go. Shall we move forward? So, as we will start this podcast in the same way as we always do, which is to talk briefly about what we've been photographing since we last got together. It has been a few weeks, so certainly speaking to Kingsley and Will, it sounds like you guys have been up to quite a lot. So I'll come to you first, Kingsley. You've had a very varied few weeks by the looks of it.
Have I? I'm trying to think back. It's just, I mean, to be honest, like everything's up in the air at the moment, isn't it? There's a lot going on in the world to take up your grey matter, and I've completely forgotten the list of things that I'd done over the last few weeks. But you are right. I spent a week in the Peaks, which was a almost complete and total washout in as far as photography. Although I did get to test the Z9 a little bit further on some sort of wildlife kind of things, but the fact that there were kind of 70-80 mile an hour winds meant that I was sensible and didn't go up onto any peaks or edges when the wind was too high. Although I was tempted because they do sort of sit there and glitter in the sunlight, and you kind of think, oh, it can't be that bad up there. And there was the first night I was there, actually, it wasn't too bad, the weather, and I knew that weather was going to get bad after that. So I went up, and it was this a place called Black Rock, which overlooks or is above Wirksworth, where I was staying, and you can shoot it. You can shoot the sort of the town kind of below it. And so I got up there, and as soon as I got up there, this huge black cloud sort of rolled in, and the wind started picking up. And the closer I got to the edge, it was like fighting to kind of remain upright. Fortunately, it was blowing, in rather than blowing in the opposite direction. So that wasn't too bad. On the opposite end of the scale, and to sort of shed a little bit of light on the scintillating life of the commercial and professional photographer, I went and did some photography of a company that makes chip shop equipment. So that was a laugh.
Okay. What, a deep fat fryer? Or
yeah, literally.
Right.
Yeah,
okay.
literally a case of, I mean, very, very nice people. I had a nice time doing it, but it was kind of like when I got the call, I was kind of either through a mixture of not listening or sort of fantasizing. I was thinking, oh, now I imagine it's going to be this kind of like, nice sort of portraits of chefs and people kind of holding freshly fried fish towards me and stuff like that. And it was a case of, we need a large, high-resolution picture of this piece of frying equipment. So, okay, right, fine. But this is it. This is the funny thing is, a lot of people kind of, have a nice kind of idea or fantasy about what it is like to earn money from photography, and obviously you have to take the kind of all sorts of jobs, I guess, along the way to kind of do that.
Now, the last time I was in my local chip shop, I seem to recall that the items in question are fairly metallic in their nature, and so therefore quite reflective, I would have thought. So did this create issues from a photographic perspective, or have you just supplied a load of pictures with you and your tripod in kind of like slightly distorted manner down the side of this deep fat fryer?
Fortunately, no reflections of me were visible. Had they been, they would have been stretched into even more monstrous shapes than my face already is. But I think so you've reminded me now. I mean, I did check that when I was shooting it. You look around and you try and see those kind of things because and when you see something, then you have to change your camera position or do something to try and kind of minimize the reflection. And it reminded me of a very amusing series of images I saw online not so long ago, all about people trying to sell mirrors on eBay and stuff like that. And it's all these hilarious pictures of people trying to get out of the way of mirrors and the different ways they've tried to photograph them not to get their reflection in it. It's brilliant.
Excellent. Now, of course, I couldn't possibly move over to Will without first of all asking about, on the last podcast, you were discussing the potential demise of your drone, which you'd managed to fly into your own car at some point. And I presume it didn't get an outing, high winds, but is there any drone related updates that you could offer to the listeners who are no doubt on tenterhooks?
Yeah. Well, actually, the drone lives, and not through anything that I have done. Although I don't know, perhaps Positive Vibes. Do they work with drones? I'm not sure. But what I did was I went through, because I had a rubbish day, the day that I thought I'd broken my drone. I also had like a blowout a tire, and I just put it back in its bag, and I just thought, oh God, I'll just leave it. I just forget about it. I left it. And I think perhaps we spoke about this last time, and you mentioned that there was the possibility that it may heal itself. And lo and behold, when I tried it again, it functioned perfectly. I mean, well, I say it functioned perfectly. I switched it on, took off, ran the video, moved it about a bit, and it seems absolutely fine. But I am going to wait for nice still conditions to give it a proper test to make sure it's not, listing or vibrating too much or anything like that.
Wonderful, good news, good to hear. Well, over to you, Will. You've been down to the capital, I believe, to have a little wander around and take some pictures. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's right, Rog. And I mean, it was a tough thing to think about, really, and decide, because after all this pandemic stuff that's been going on for the last two years, I'm slightly paranoid still. But Annie and I were mulling what we're going to do on Friday. We had a day off, and we decided let's risk it. Let's put our masks on and go into central London, and that's what we did. And it was wonderful. We had really good weather, unlike Kingsley. The sun shone most of the time. It's a bit cloudy. It was busy, remarkably busy actually, along the South Bank. I could hear a lot of French being spoken, quite a bit of German, and I'm assuming they were tourists as opposed to locals. I still wore my mask on the tube, and a lot of people did still, but it wasn't crowded. It wasn't bustling. I mean, I did go to a couple of shops while I was in London, and in previous times, pre-pandemic, if you go to the shops, they were rammed. They were literally like you moved around like in a orderly fashion to get around to various bits of the shop you wanted to get to. But this time it was fine. More staff than customers. So I mean, so the pandemic stuff, yeah, that's easing. It's great. I had good light. We walked along the South Bank, and because sunset is a decent time at the moment, it's quite civilized. It's about 5:30, so you don't have to hang around for hours waiting for sunset. And there's still lots of people about. So if you wanted that combination of low sun and people, you got it. And there's one particular shot I wanted, Rog. That's why I went, and I wanted a shot off Tower Bridge. And it's from Tower Bridge facing towards City Hall. So you're looking towards upriver with the South Bank on your left, those of you who are familiar with London. And City Hall was that dome building on the left-hand side. And I've taken photographs of that in the past where that's been lit up. So you get that combination of office lighting and ambient lighting. And that's what I wanted. Anyway, I got there, put the tripod up, and I took along a Gitso travel tripod, which I rested on the bridge, which I've done before. And I focused up on City Hall, and I realised as it was getting darker that City Hall wasn't getting any lighter. i.e., there's nobody in the offices. I thought, what's going on here? Anyway, because I'm not a Londoner, and actually Annie is a Londoner, but she didn't know either. But the council have moved. City Hall is an empty building. They've moved to they moved to the Crystal over at in the east of London, near Royal Victoria DLR station, which oddly enough I have photographed. But yeah, they've moved, and I didn't know that. I say, why should I? So the picture I wanted, having lugged a telephoto lens down and a tripod to shoot, did not materialise.
So it sounds like it's a good time to go to London photographically because it's not too rammed, as long as you don't want to photograph City Hall, then, by the sounds of it, at twilight at least.
At twilight, yeah, only for that particular picture, because when you look up the river, there's a number of office blocks behind City Hall that you could use as a background. But to be fair, some of those offices were dark as well, some of those floors. I don't know whether that's an issue with the pandemic or, fallout from the pandemic, but who knows? But certainly the scene was not what I had in my mind's eye and which I've previously photographed. I just wanted some more variety in different lights. But that aside, I mean, I was very happy. We had a good 3 or 4 hours walking along. We didn't get wet, didn't get too cold, didn't get blown off our feet like Kingsley. Only got hassled once by security. And that was because
you weren't trying hard enough.
No, that's true. It was just typical though that Annie and I were just setting up our cameras, and literally we got to London, got out the tube, got out the main line actually, and we were there standing on the South Bank, just getting our kit out, and literally not doing anything at all. But we were just standing there with our cameras and photographing the ground to make sure everything works. You know, the sort of thing you do before you start photography. And the woman came out of the security booth and said, well, basically it was on the lines, this is private property. And I just do what I normally do with these people. I just walk away. It's none of their business what I do. And literally we were doing nothing but just getting ourselves ready. And she was polite about it, but it's interesting. But my reaction, I used to be up for a scrap and an argument about, don't we know about our rights as photographers, but I just walk away nowadays.
Interesting.
That aside, it was fine. It was good shoot.
My photo opportunities have, as I mentioned before on the previous podcast, been quite limited. All of my time is being taken up by a small 4-legged animal, which is she's preventing me from doing pretty much anything apart from take things out of her mouth and follow her around the house to make sure she's not chewing anything. She's as I think you said, Kingsley, the best opportunities with puppies come when they're asleep, and so got a few pictures of the puppy asleep. And I've also been learning a little bit about my Fujifilm XE4 because, as you'll also know, puppies don't sit still for very long. So I'm trying to get quicker at being ready to take a picture when it comes around. So I've been delving quite deeply into the various menus and switching on things like pre-AF. And continuous focus and all this sort of thing, just to try and make sure that the camera's actually set up, ready to go, so that if she does park herself in a position momentarily, then I have half decent chance of getting a shot. But the hit rate is still pretty terrible, I have to admit. And I think I'm woefully out of practice, and I'm looking forward to her running around in the garden a lot more, to be honest.
I think that is just kind of run of the mill, though. Really, I mean, you're always going to end up with hundreds and hundreds of pictures that you're going to whittle down to stuff that the most important thing is usually to keep at it, isn't it? And kind of like, obviously, like with most animal subjects, pets and things, kind of getting down close to the floor and making it part of the game and stuff, and maybe trying to send them with a toy through predictable paths or something.
Yeah,
I always wanted to do one of the, with babies they do this abhorrent thing called a cake smash, and people photograph that. And but I always thought it'd be far more amusing to do it with a dog or a puppy, that you would kind of have just like a pile of pedigreed chum. Other dog foods are available, of course, and that you would kind of have them sort of gnawing their way through that.
I think the biggest problem I've got is actually with backgrounds. It's not so much, I mean, yes, it's the focus and that sort of thing, but it's actually what's behind it. And like half the time, especially when you're trying to photograph her inside, it's kind of, there's chair legs and curtains, and it doesn't make for a particularly pleasing picture overall. So it definitely needs to be outdoors. I noticed that a lot of your pictures, Kingsley, you don't have shots of chair legs included. In fact, you normally have the dog on the chair rather than next to the chair.
That is a good plan. Also, if you remember rightly, my dog ate a whole chair, so that's another reason why we don't have many chair legs around.
Now, of course, moving on, Will, you weren't just in London, or you did 2 trips to London, and I believe that the second trip was recce for something really quite special related to the magazine. Am I correct?
Correct, you are, Rog. Yeah, I went down there because I wanted to check out venues for an event we've got coming up, which many regular listeners and readers will know about, but it's called Photo24. This is a 24-hour photo shoot, which normally happens around the longest day of the year. And obviously for the last 2 years, it hasn't happened. But this year we're steaming ahead. We did announce a date in the previous issue, the date being the 25th and 26th of June, with a 12 noon start. So we were checking out venues in London, like I said, to basically use as what we call HQ, which is kind of the base we have, Rog, where, as you know, we have our launch event, we have computers available during the day, we have staff there manning it, and we've got a real nice spot actually, right in the middle of London, not far from the West End at all. Very swish actually, so I was quite impressed. So we've booked that. We're still working on details of it, but basically for listeners who want to join up with Photo24, the opportunity to apply for a place on it will be available on our website from March the 15th. That's photographynews.co.uk. So basically you apply for it, and we're going to keep the applications open for a couple of months so that there's no huge rush. And this is trying to basically to be as fair to people as we can, because places on Photo24 are limited, and this year we're limited to 200. And so some people might come to this a bit later on. So we're giving people who maybe stumble across the event in a few weeks' time, or even 6 weeks' time, and they can still apply for it and have a fair chance. Because what we're going to do is applications open on March the 15th. They close on May the 17th, and then we'll just have a ballot for the places. After 2 years, it's going to be fun, and I think the readers will be really up for it to come along and just have a great time with their cameras in central London for 24 hours.
Now, Will, you mentioned photographynews.co.uk there, which is obviously also the place to go and view the very latest issue. There is one obviously in the works right now. Any particular highlights that you want to bring to our attention?
Yeah, we're working on issue 97. And I know we discussed it in the last pod, and it's had an awful lot of hype, but sorry, but I'm going to have to mention it again. But there's a test of the Nikon Z9 in there, and I did have a couple of weeks with that camera, and I know it's an expensive camera. It's what, £5,300, and there don't seem to be that many available. But it's still an interesting review, I think, because it sets the stall up for Nikon, because Nikon lagged behind a little bit to Sony and Canon in terms of its autofocusing, for example. And the Z9 has really helped them catch up, I think. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what people do. I mean, I've been watching people comparing it with the Sony A1 and the Canon EOS R5 and the EOS R3, and it seems quite mixed. But I was doing some side by side, and I was impressed with the Z9, and I'm impressed with it as a camera as a whole. Now, I'm sure Kingsley, who's also looking at it, will have some nice things to say about it. But there's a big test in the next issue, and I really loved, even though I put in my review, I don't know who would use it, but I loved using it, and that's the mode where you can shoot 120 frames per second. And it's great. And there's some pictures I used in the review, which hopefully people get to see, but of a gull taking off. Actually, was it taking off or landing? I got both, but you can see its feet repositioning really slightly in between frames, and you've got 120 frames per second with tracking and exposure tracking as well. It's like, good God. Like I said, I don't know who would use it, but I have to say I loved using it myself. But that's because it was a bit of fun. What I didn't like, of course, was then going through the thousands and thousands of JPEGs I ended up with. But that's the penalty. But Rog, sorry, another long answer. Yeah, the Z9 is a particular highlight, as well as the Photo24 launch reinforcement in the next issue.
Let's talk a little bit about Micro Four Thirds. We thought we'd delve into this because Micro Four Thirds as a system has kind of been a little bit forgotten, we felt, in recent months and perhaps even years. But having said that, there's been two cameras that have been launched in quick succession of one another, and that is the OM System OM1 and the Panasonic GH6, both of which use that Micro Four Thirds sensor. So we thought it was a good opportunity just to talk a little bit about those two cameras and about the Micro Four Thirds format in general, because it might be one that is not being considered quite so much, but clearly there are two manufacturers there who still believe in it as a viable entity. So Kingsley, I'm going to come to you first. Maybe you could just take us very quickly through kind of key highlights from the Panasonic GH6.
Well, I mean, the funny thing is, of the two cameras that you mentioned, it's sort of, in some ways, it's the less interesting for stills photographers, because it is a very, very complete hybrid camera. But like the other GH cameras, it is kind of basically aimed at people who either are shooting video as much as they are stills, or video alone, because it's this kind of like fantastic kind of movie making body. But I mean, from a stills point, and actually what, we'll get the video out the way. It shoots like 5.7K video, which obviously isn't 8K, but then, you know, arguably who needs 8K? I don't know. It shoots 4K at 120p and 1080, which is full HD, at 240p. So, you know, lots of sort of slow motion options there. And of course, there's like a bunch of other brilliant stuff, like, you know, 10-bit high quality video sort of within that. From a stills perspective, it's a 25 megapixel sensor, which I think is sort of top of the range for the Micro Four Thirds cameras. Will's nodding his head, and actually this makes some sort of sense, because you can then also use it's got a high res mode, which is actually kind of common on a lot of cameras these days, where they use the IBIS, the sensor based image stabilization module, to move the sensor around and create kind of higher resolution images. And with this one, you can make 100 megapixel images. And as part of, I mean, I haven't tested it, but Panasonic say that you can do this handheld, which is, you know, if true, and obviously those kind of systems depend quite a lot on subject movement and stuff like that. So if you've got trees moving around between frames, you know, how does the processor work that stuff out? But, you know, if it works, then it's a really interesting kind of you know, tool to have, isn't it? I mean, in addition to that, being a small sensor, it offers very quick shooting. It can shoot up to 75 frames per second with its electronic shutter. But if you ever look at the spec, the mechanical shutter is limited to 8 or 14 frames per second. So, I mean, it feels a bit laughable to say, oh, you know, so it's not that fast. I mean, who needs more than 14 frames a second? I don't know.
Well,
but I mean,
that
is actually, well, yeah, maybe if you're shooting puppies, yeah. I mean, that is, as I say, with the mechanical shutter, and also 14 frames a second is with in single AF mode, so not the continuous mode. And with the mechanical shutter in continuous AF, that's where you get your 8 frames a second. So, you know, again, like 8 frames a second. I mean, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, I was only using like a D810 Nikon or something like that, and I think that topped out at about 6 or 7. And maybe you got a bit more if you stuck a battery pack on it, and I thought it was amazing. So I don't like, I mean, you know, brilliant. I mean, it's, you know, and like previous versions, it's small, it's light, weather sealed.
That sensor, Kingsley, it's not a stacked sensor, is it?
No, it's not, but but they have kind of increased the readout speed on it to such an extent that it can do these kind of whizzy things. So one of the reasons why people have these stack sensors is because that in itself picks up the readout speed. But with a smaller sensor, obviously you don't have as many lines to kind of skip through, so to speak. So you do have the option to kind of to do that instead, I guess.
I suppose I was thinking more along the lines of squeezing 25 million pixels onto a smaller sensor is presumably going to have an adverse effect on the ISO performance. So if they've not gone for a stack sensor design, is there any early indications as to whether or not the ISO performance is any good?
I guess that's. I mean, the ISO range is 100 to 25,600. I think we've come a long way from the early days of 4/3 and micro 4/3 sensors, where you were in dangerous territory if you took them too far over. Like I don't know, sort of 3200 or something. But like I would have thought it does pretty well. I mean, the GH5 certainly performed pretty well at high ISOs. I mean, again, it sort of comes down to one of these things where it kind of depends not only how closely you look, but also how hard you push your processing. If you're sort of exposing in a sensible fashion, and not having to kind of like bump everything up in RAW or something, or boost shadow detail, then you're going to get a better result than you would be otherwise.
So moving on to the other camera then, Will, the OM System OM1. Now, first of all, explain to me the name change.
Well, the name change from OM System from Olympus was primarily due to the fact that Olympus, as a company, sold off their imaging division last year. And it was bought by another Japanese company. I've no idea why they sold it off. Maybe it wasn't earning enough money for Olympus, because of course they're very big in things like medical products. So the OM System is coming out from OM Digital Solutions, the new company. And although despite that, the OM1 has got the Olympus branding on it, which is a little confusing, but I've been assured, and I've seen it written in various other places, that it'll be the last time that an OM Systems product will have the brand name Olympus on it. And that's basically to celebrate the fact that Olympus's landmark camera, the Olympus OM1, the film camera, came out in 1972. So 50 years ago. So they're just basically bigging up the heritage of the system. And that's fair play. And that's one reason why in the latest issue, in issue 97, I've actually got a film OM1. So I've featured it in the used corner section. But the OM1, the digital OM1, it looks an interesting camera. It's a $2,000 camera body, which is the same price, incidentally, as the Panasonic GH6. It's got a new sensor in it. But yeah, it's backside illuminated and stacked, and it's 20 megapixels. So unlike the Panasonic camera, which is 25.2 megapixels, this is still 20. I was a little surprised. I did ask during the presentation we had on this via Zoom, I did ask the marketing guy from the UK company, was there any consideration of going up to 24 megapixels, say? But apparently there's no need for it. The research among current users and would-be users is that they much rather have better noise performance than more resolution, because as you mentioned earlier, the gain in resolution can impact on noise performance. So what Olympus claimed for this camera, the OM1, is a two-stop benefit, so that if you shoot at 12,800 on the new camera, that's kind of you're going to get the benefit of it looking like 3,200. But it looks interesting because of the features it has. It's got a new AF system. It's the first camera to use what they call cross quad pixel AF, and this is just to help sensitivity when dealing with linear subjects. And you can shoot 50 frames per second, blackout free, with AF and AE tracking. It looks really, really nice. But other things too. I mean, you've got flash sync on this camera now, so as readout speeds from electronic cameras is getting quicker and quicker, we're getting flash sync with electronic cameras. So the Olympus OM1, sorry, the OM System OM1, you can sync 100th of a second, which I think is pretty good. It's not as good as the Nikon Z9, but it's still pretty good. And it's got some nice features like live ND. It's got faster focus stacking, and like on the Panasonic, it's got a high res mode. It's got a handheld high res mode, and you can shoot 50 megapixel images with it. Bung it on a tripod, you get 80 megapixels. Obviously, again, that's subject dependent. There's nothing there from what I can see that compensates for any movement. But if you've got a static subject, if you're copying or doing a building with nothing moving around, then hey, you can enjoy some real high resolution images. So it looks interesting, Rog.
Excellent. Now, we were talking a little bit earlier, Will, about the kind of initial launch when Olympus were involved with the kind of micro four thirds format. And you remember something quite distinct about the initial marketing ploy from Olympus when that camera first came out. And I think it's quite interesting just to delve back a little bit into the history of the system, just to understand a little bit about why it came about. So, what was it in particular that you were telling us only a few minutes ago?
Well, Roger, it's going back to the unveiling of the format. It was actually Panasonic, the event I particularly was referring to, but the event was at Photokina, and Photokina used to be this huge photographic imaging show over in Cologne in Germany. It's now no longer around. It's evolved to something else. But it used to be this big show, and Panasonic invited us to this event. There were hundreds of us in this hall, and they launched this format called Micro Four Thirds. And one of the things they made a big song and dance about it, I remember it quite distinctly at the time, was the fact that they wanted to attract women photographers. There's a benefit of the Micro Four Thirds being a smaller format. It's only a 17 by 13 millimeter format compared with the 24 by 36 millimeter from a 35 millimeter format. So it's much smaller, which made the smaller body form, which made it more portable. And all the women photographers at the time who might have been using compact cameras or their phones, whatever they might have been using, or been put off using a DSLR type camera because of its bulk, this was going to be for them. And it was, I think it's a really good ploy. I mean, obviously, we know people generally, whatever gender, will use this particular format, and I think very good it has been too. My partner Annie uses it, and she loves her Olympus cameras, and she particularly is fond of the 2x crop. So she's got a 300 millimeter lens, which is quite hand holdable, but of course the effect is a 600 millimeter lens in 35 millimeter format, which is very expensive and very heavy. So the format has its appeal, and I like it. When I do street photography, I often take one out because it's small, light, unobtrusive, and I think that's one thing about it, because it doesn't look professional, if that makes sense. Because if you take a camera which looks a bit too professional, you can get people around you who might be more wary of you. But this looks like an enthusiast camera, and people take less notice of you. So I think there's definitely room for the system, and I'm really looking forward to trying the OM1 and see how it does.
Kingsley, I was going to come to you. I mean, Will's covered off some of the key benefits of the system there in terms of the focal length and the fact you can have a 300mm lens, which I know is a particular favoured focal length for yourself, one that you could fit into a trouser pocket, perhaps. But is there anything else that kind of stands out for you in terms of the format, in terms of its history, and also its kind of uses now?
I think that in some ways it's a sad tale. The 4/3 tale. It's like when I started working on photographic magazines, the Olympus E System was going pretty strong, and I had a kind of a soft spot for those, and I had I think an E410 on loan for a long time, which is a nice small little kind of DSLR style camera, and I used to take that traveling and took it to Tokyo and places like that with a little pancake lens. It was a really, in fact, it was a 25mm lens, so it was a 50mm equivalent, and it was a lovely little package, really. And also they made it with. See, Olympus were always really smart with this stuff, and they continued doing it when they brought out the pen cameras, which were sort of among the first micro 4/3. But when they were making the original 4/3 system, a lot of their cameras they brought out with these nice leather cases, like these sort of half leather cases, so you could feel quite the gentleman around Tokyo with your with your lovely gear. I think they totally had their place. They were the unfortunate thing was in some ways was that it was at a time when people were trying to kind of accelerate towards full frame, cheaper and cheaper full frame cameras, and kind of when stuff like the Canon 5D original kind of came out, and Nikon D700, everyone was making eyes at them, and suddenly smaller sensors didn't seem quite so attractive, and yet they to this day they remain very, very, very good for certain solutions, particularly like those ones that Will mentioned, in terms of kind of wildlife photography and stuff like that. And also, as Will also said, street photography, because you've got smaller, lighter, kind of less noticeable kit that you're carrying around. And as we mentioned plenty of episodes ago, we had a reader write in about lens choices. They were bemoaning the fact that there were no new micro four thirds lenses being launched, and that's because the market is already full of them. There are tons of brilliant micro four thirds lenses out there, and they're quite cheap. So in many ways, it's a really attractive system for people who are kind of starting out in photography. And one last thing to tub thump about four thirds and micro four thirds is that obviously it's sort of kind of goes unnoticed these days, but Olympus and Panasonic were amongst the first people who were getting rid of the mirror box and kind of turning these. I mean, people don't remember four thirds DSLRs as DSLRs because they were kind of small. They were small by design anyway, but obviously removing the mirror box and going to the micro four thirds system made them even smaller and more portable again.
So basically, what we're saying is we're collectively still very much fans of the micro four thirds system.
I had a GF1. I had a Panasonic GF1, which that's why I mentioned the GF6 earlier. Or a sort of if a GF6 were to be created, because the GF1 was one of these cameras that came out. Christ, when was that? Kind of late noughties, and it was this kind of small, kind of squarish retro looking body. And I just remember the image, clearly the tuning of the sensor or something, the image quality was really nice out of it as well. Just got, I don't know, you have sort of fond memories of certain cameras, don't you?
Go on, Will.
No, sorry, just being super duper geeky. While Kingsley was talking, I was just on Wikipedia, and since 2008, when the G1 came out, there have been 71, actually 72 now with the Panasonic micro four thirds cameras. So the OM1 was the 71st, and the Panasonic GH6 is the 72nd. And actually looking at Wikipedia quickly, I haven't broken down to the figures, but that's quite amazing, isn't it? In a relatively short time. I mean, that's 14 years. What's my maths like? It's 14 years since 2008, and we've had 71 cameras. That's going some, isn't it?
It is going some.
I mentioned two brands too.
So there's obviously still quite an appeal for them, and I suppose, Will, I was just going to ask about, because of your extensive experience of testing cameras, I suppose it's easy to get into the mindset that smaller sensor must mean kind of not as good quality pictures. But I think, as you've alluded to, with your partner Annie being very happy with the results she gets from the camera, and my limited experience of working with micro four thirds image cameras, they always seem to produce a really good file, to be honest. So they're not an inferior, they're just an alternative, right?
Yeah, and I think alternative is a very good thing. I think we should give prospective camera users as many choices as possible. I mean, let's face it, camera sales aren't booming exactly because of the way phones are going. So I think anything that comes along to encourage people to use, let's say, real cameras as opposed to phones, then I think we should welcome it with open arms. And you're right about the performance as well, Rog. I mean, we get a bit, I mean, I certainly do, because I know when I'm doing it, but I get a bit snooty about megapixel and noise performance and all the rest of it. But, these files are remarkably good, and it's certainly big enough for big enlargement. I mean, we know several professionals who use it, and they produce really lovely big prints, absolutely no problem at all. And so also now with the softwares, and for instance, the Topaz denoise or DxO Pure Raw, these things take out noise as well, and they do such a good job with it, and you can get away with murder now. And also the other thing, a lot of people have forgotten how bad fast film was. I mean, if you scan in a ISO 3200 negative, which is the fastest film you could buy when film was around in the way it used to be, the noise, the grain was horrendous. It was like marbles. And you now can shoot most modern cameras at ISO 3200, ISO 6400, and not worry about noise at all, especially with some sympathetic processing. And considering, of course, what most people do with their pictures, which is look at them on screen or put them on social networking sites, then it's a non-issue. So no, more power to the elbow of Olympus and Panasonic for keeping up with the Micro Four Thirds format. And so I'm really looking forward to trying both cameras. I'm expecting big things.
I suppose the only sort of query I would have, Kingsley, is in terms of those two cameras. Will's mentioned the price tag for both is around about £2,000. Now, if I'm sort of thinking, if I'm looking at that next to an APS-C camera, for example, there's plenty of APS-C cameras that are kind of sitting well below that price point. So, admittedly, these two cameras are certainly, big slabs of technology, but presumably that's a bit of an uphill battle, isn't it, in terms of marketing these cameras? That the price point seems very much almost full frame-esque in terms of where they're pricing them.
Yeah, I mean, they are. I suppose it has to be pointed out that they are the flagship models, or certainly currently they are. I mean, I'm not sure. There was something within the OM system announcement that suggested them. I guess the next one maybe even higher spec or something, but we don't know much about that yet. But yeah, I mean, I would guess, like all things, you can pick out the features kind of that you like, and find them in kind of in cheaper bodies. But you're right in terms of, I guess it all comes down to kind of like the balance between kind of what you want from your photography, because there are physical limitations to a smaller sensor, and the other side of that biscuit, so to speak, is that
coin for most people, but we'll go with biscuit, given that your name is Cakes.
I think this is an Irish term that I've picked up from somewhere. Is that larger sensors do things like give you more shallow depth of field control and stuff like that, but they come in bigger, heavier packages. So take your chances.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to see these two products come so close together. Will, I look forward to reading about your findings of the pair of them as and when you get round to testing them in the latest issue, and of course or in a future issue, sorry. And of course we'd love to hear from any listeners who enjoy Micro Four Thirds themselves, who are invested in the system, and we'd love to see or hear from you in terms of how you get on with your cameras. So moving forwards, let's answer some listener questions. We've got 3 questions this time round. All these people got in touch with us via our email, which is podcast@photographynews.co.uk. So, Will, I'm going to come to you with the first one, which comes to us from a chap called Oscar. And he said, I'd like to buy myself some studio lights, and LEDs seem more user-friendly than flash. Are they a viable alternative, or would I be better sticking with flash and learning how to use them properly? So I'm sure it's a conundrum that a lot of photographers face, and a lot of people who certainly are a bit flash phobic. Certainly a continuous light source seems better. But what's your feelings on this one, Will?
Well, ultimately, I think you need both. Right. I mean, they're different jobs. I mean, Oscar, he doesn't mention how much he's got to spend on studio lights or LEDs, but I consider getting both. I mean, LEDs are relatively cheap. You can get panels for, well, I mean, I'm lit by one at the moment, which costs about 30 quid, which is an on-camera panel. I've got some over there in the corner I'm shooting still life with, and I think they're like 60 quid a panel. So they're not hideously expensive. But Oscar, if you can, I would consider both. But it depends what he's shooting. If he's shooting, he wants to shoot kids dashing around, or a model waving their hair around, and you want to freeze the action, or you're photographing dancers or whatever, then clearly you need flash. If you want to stop the action, flash is, a flash burst can last, well, at the very high end, can last a 20,000th of a second, but a studio flash might last 500th of a second, but still plenty enough to stop action. You can't do that sort of photography with LEDs, but LEDs are great. There's no heat generated when you use them, so I use them for still life. And I've been shooting with some shelves recently, and I've just sat there, a couple of lights on top, and fiddling around. It's great, and what you see is what you get, which of course with flash, you need a bit of expertise and a bit of practice before you get that feeling. And of course, it depends what flash he goes for. He's going to go studio flash, or he's going to go for speed lights, which you can then put on stands and use them off camera. I mean, it's quite a big question, Rog, if I was honest.
Yeah.
But I would consider doing both, and I've got both, and I use both with fair degrees of regularity too.
Wonderful. Well, this is the podcast that we answer the big questions on, Will, so we shouldn't shy away from them. But I am just going to ask Kingsley very quickly. In terms of LEDs, obviously there are benefits in terms of exactly as Will says, what you see is what you get. What about modifiers? I mean, if Oscar's going to want to use kind of like soft boxes and, you know, barn doors and snoots and what have you, and filters and what have you, I'm assuming that that flash is the better option in that respect.
It can be in some ways, and certainly, I mean, there are some LED lighting systems that have adopted what you would call kind of generic flash mounts, so that you can use easily, you know, the same kind of modifiers across both systems. That's not always the case. One other thing that I would say, sort of on the strength of that, is that LED light can seem very bright to sort of the naked eye, but comparatively with flash, it isn't. And as soon as you put a softbox on the front of something, you're immediately cutting out another couple of stops of light. And therefore, you know, your shutter speed drops and drops and drops. So you need, you know, either they need to be brighter or you need to up your ISO or something like that. So like Will was saying, you know, if power is important, then flash can be the way to go. One of the things I picked up from that question was, you know, about the idea of learning how to use, you know, flash properly and the kind of, you know, that would seem to tie into that idea of the simplicity of LEDs being that, as Will mentioned, you what you see is what you get. But, you know, people have been using flash for hundreds of years with, you know, and understanding how it works. It's not like, it's not the most difficult thing in the world. It's just a case of giving yourself a few hours an evening or a couple of, you know, a few days just to experiment and kind of see how things work. And also making use of stuff like your modeling light and doing that. Oh, there's an old trick, isn't there, where you kind of, you squint as you look at with the, you know, it freaks the model out a bit sometimes, but like squint a bit, and that kind of gives you a better idea of the contrast that you're developing when you're using kind of modeling lights.
Right.
And one other thing is that's in favor of LED lights these days is of course that they're more easy to adapt in terms of color. So you have a lot of bi-color LEDs where you can set them between typical lighting situations like, you know, tungsten or daylight, but then also you have these kind of brilliant nan-like pavo tube type things where, you know, they're proper RGB lights and you can dial in whatever colors you want, so you can do kind of interesting kind of cross lighting effects and stuff like that. So yeah, tricky, isn't it?
But generally speaking, I think if I can summarize it and perhaps give Oscar the answer to his big question, I think it does come down to that sort of power out, because I think, like you say, Will, you can pick them up for 30 quid, but then that's not going to light an entire room, is it? It's going to, you know, those 30 quid panels are going to be something that will be able to light a small still life setup, for example, but are not going to be able to successfully light an entire model, you know, from head to toe. So I suppose it probably, his usage is probably the biggest thing to consider in terms of not only you know, whether he wants to try and freeze the action, but also how big the area he wants to light is. And so maybe that should be what influences his decision the most, unless of course he's particularly well heeled, such as yourself, Will, in which case he can go out and lash out on a full LED system and a full flash system. Do we think, are we happy with that as an answer to that question?
Yeah, I think it's fair summing up, Roger. Oscar needs to funnel down what he wants to do with it and how he wants to do it. But there are definitely pros and cons of both. But equally, I think there's every reason to have both if he can afford it.
Okay, good stuff. Well, let's move on to another question. I'm going to throw this one to you, Kingsley, and this comes from the wonderfully named Santino, who emailed in this one. And I'm assuming it's a he. Forgive me, Santino, if you're a she. I create a lot of architecture images, and I'm considering buying a tilt shift lens. Are they tricky to use, and can they be used for any images other than buildings? Kingsley, you look like a kind of tilt shift kind of guy.
I wish. I've actually, like, a tilt shift lens is something that I've always aspired to own, but never actually got around to buying one. And I did have my head turned not so long ago by, we've mentioned a company before on here called Laowa, who they do some quite affordable shift lenses. The reason for, just to give a bit of sort of extra info, the reason for having a shift lens for architectural photography is that I mean, they get grouped into tilt shift lenses because that's the common way of sort of designing them, but it's the shift part of it that you're interested in, really, mostly for those architectural shots. And what they do is these lenses create larger image circles than regular lenses, and what you do is you physically push the lens up, down, left, or right to make it easier to compose architectural, sort of tall architectural subjects. So typically what will happen is, if you're trying to fit in a whole tall building with a wide angle lens, you'll tilt your camera upwards and all the lines will start converging and falling in. But on a shift lens, all you do is shift the lens upwards, and that gives you this kind of more kind of natural view of the subject, sort of while taking it all in. Right, so what are we splitting this into? Are they easy
Are
to
they
use?
tricky to use? Yeah, thanks for the background. That's very helpful. I think Santino knew that already, but presumably the majority of the listeners didn't. But are they tricky to use?
Only insofar as most of them are manual focus and will require manual exposure, and on top of that, most of them, in fact, I think all of them, because of the way they're designed, wouldn't have weather sealing on them, because they have sort of components which kind of effectively, sort of split the lens barrel in terms of how they shift. So, and some of them, the wider ones, have similar problem to ultra wide angle lenses where they have front elements where you can't screw filters onto, so that can be an issue. But no, they're not they're not particularly difficult to use. And as soon as you start playing with them, you understand kind of the worth of it. And so the other part of that was, are they useful for anything else? And the one thing that springs to mind for me in terms of the shift function is panoramas. So if you want to shoot a pano, you can turn the lens to shift horizontally, and then you shoot 3 images that way rather than actually physically moving the camera. So that's a good solution to that.
And I think that the tilt element is sometimes used in product photography, isn't it?
Yeah, the tilt. I mean, you could conceivably use the tilt element. If you were shooting down I don't know, like an avenue where you wanted to get all the trees perfectly in focus, then you'd use the tilt function for that. But the tilt function, as we've agreed, Santino knows full well, but everyone else may not. The tilt function is about altering the plane of focus rather than the sort of the angle of view of the lens.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a very comprehensive answer, Kingsley. So I hope Santino will be happy with that. Will, I'm going to come back to you with another lens question, or a final question here, which is from Katie R. I'm keen to photograph more wildlife, so I'm going to get a new lens. I'm a Canon EOS user, and I'm looking at the used market. Would you advise I buy something like a 70 to 300mm telezoom or a 300mm fixed telephoto?
I'd like the idea. I mean, if I was kitting up for nature now, I'd buy a fixed telephoto and find the fastest one I could afford. But this is where the budget comes in, because if you found a Canon 300mm 2.8, it's going to be an awful lot of money. The f4 would be cheaper, but of course then the benefit between that and the 70-300 telezoom might only be one f-stop. It's a difficult one. There's definitely cases for both. And the 70-300 will obviously have a bit more versatility. You may be able to tackle other naturey subjects with it, where the 300mm, I know it's Kingsley's standard lens, so for him it matters not a jot, but a 300mm lens might be limiting in some ways because it might not focus close enough, and of course they can be generally a little bulkier than a zoom. It's a difficult one. Oh, I don't know, Katie, you've got me on a spot here. I would suggest, if you can afford it, buy a 300mm fixed. But bear in mind that you may have versatility wise, you may compromise that with a fixed lens, and that's worth considering too. Oh, I don't know, guys. It's a tricky question.
There's some spectacular fence sitting on your part.
I'm very.
Kingsley, I think for a defining answer, I think I can come to you, because surely, as a fan of the fixed telephoto lens, you're gonna tell Katie that there really is only one purchase to make here.
Well, curiously, just just sort of looking up the different options, particularly second-hand, high quality second-hand lenses. The prices are pretty similar between a 70 to 200 f4 to 5.6 Canon and a 300mm f4. So there's it makes it even more complicated, really. I was expecting one of them to be way more expensive than the other. For my part, I have never had a 70-300. I have a 70-200 and a 300mm prime, but I also have a 1.4 teleconverter. So with the 300, and this is what I would suggest perhaps Katie look at as well, is I mean, really, like, if it's wildlife, you're looking at the long end, aren't you? You're after the reach. Yes, the versatility is great, but you really want the reach. So I'd go for the 300 prime and maybe look to divert a bit more budget into a 1.4 teleconverter.
I'm totally with you. It's a 300mm all the way for me, Katie. Never mind old fence sitter Will over there.
Also, there's I mean, it's got a bit more panache, isn't it?
It's definitely got a bit more panache. Yeah, absolutely. And I think photographically, it's a slightly more challenging optic to use in terms of, it's a fixed focal length, so you've got to move forwards or move backwards. I think it's a good thing for your photography all around to use prime lenses. So I'm always going to advocate a fixed lens. So I hope that answers your question, Katie. Do let us know what you come up with. If you've got a question, as I said at the start, the best way to get in touch with us is podcast@photographynews.co.uk. You can also contact us via social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and the handle for all three is @PhotoNewsPN. Well, another podcast is almost at an end, but we never end a podcast without a Will's word of wisdom. Although I'd imagine, based on this podcast performance, it will probably be fairly vague and waffly. But anyway, let's dive in and see what you're going to come up with, Will. Do you have a word of wisdom? And can you keep it short and sweet?
I do, and I do tend to be waffly on occasion. Other times I'm very succinct. And sorry, I'm just going to backtrack, Rog, if you don't mind, just a second.
What a surprise.
I did get a press release in the other day from Canon, and they've just launched, because we're talking about prime lenses, and they've just launched two RF fixed telephoto zooms, an 800mm 5.6 and a 1200mm f8, and they didn't have prices at the time on the press release, and I thought I better not going to be cheap. Anyway, I looked on some dealer websites for these lenses, and sure enough, the Canon RF 800 f5.6 LIS USM, £19,099.
Okay.
And if you can stretch to that, you can probably even go further and get the RF 1200mm f8 LIS USM. That's yours for £22,444.
Magnificent.
A snip.
That's absolutely magnificent. Anyway,
that's an aside and nothing to do with my word of wisdom. My word of wisdom is bracketing. Use it. Use exposure bracketing. Most cameras have auto exposure bracketing, where the camera, once you set up, will take a series of shots. It might be 2, 3, 5, 7, 9 shots. You can set it however you want. You can do 0.3 of an f-stop or 1 f-stop, wherever you might set. But in London the other day, I was telling you, I was photographing on a sunny day, and I was photographing some white buildings, and I was underneath Thames bridges. So obviously you've got shadow, you've got white buildings outside, and the contrast range is huge. And I know RAW is amazing. If you shoot RAW in editing, you can pull and push to an amazing degree. But you can do yourself a favor and do your editing a favor by bracketing in such situations and then merging them afterwards. Lightroom, it's got an HDR merge facility, works really well. So use auto exposure bracketing, and when you set it up, not only should you set the frames and the amount you want to bracket by, but also set the camera to continuous shooting. So basically, you pick your camera to the eye, make your composition, push the button, and you get a rat-tat-tat, or not rat-tat-tat if you've got a silent shutter, but you've got sequence of pictures taken really shortly after each other that you can merge. So that means you don't need to have a tripod, because that used to be kind of the thinking behind it. You used to use a tripod so you can bracket and then merge accurately. But if you shoot your bracket and continuous shooting, load and hold, not a problem. You're not going to get much movement between frames, and they merge perfectly. So use bracketing and make your editing life a little easier.
Thanks, Will. And just on the bracketing thing, I mean, I know you two are a right pair of bracketers. So, but what I often do is I'll just take one picture and then I'll actually do the bracketing in Lightroom later, just by tweaking the expression. Is that the same or is it not?
Well,
So if you import it into Lightroom and then just create a virtual copy at -1 and a virtual copy at +1, that's the same, isn't it?
well, kind of, but you are affecting the impact of the quality of the image. I mean, depending on the scene, and plus and -1 is not too much. But I was photographing scenes where literally it's a bright white building in the sun. I was underneath London Bridge, wherever it might be. So you got those sort of deep shadows, and to push and pull one raw of that means there's going to be some give and take in it, because you're going to gain more noise in the shadows, and your highlights could be this yucky grey as opposed to a nice clean white. So the point of bracketing is to give you the option of a bit more latitude to play with when you're dealing with really extreme situations. And that's what I'm talking about here. Not, a little bit of contrast is fine, and you can shoot raw fine, actually no problem, and save your memory card. But I'm talking about when you get real extreme, a bright sunlit subject with a really heavy shadow, and you want to work it a bit, and you want tones in both areas. You can keep your quality high by not stressing out your raw too much by bracketing.
Interesting. Good stuff. Well, that's very useful, Will. Thank you for an excellent word of wisdom there. You've redeemed yourself towards the end of the podcast. So there we go. That's episode 37, all done and dusted. We hope you found it a good listen. And so that just leaves me to say thank you very much to my two colleagues. First of all, thank you very much, Mr. Kingsley Cakes Singleton. Thanks, Kingsley.
Thank you very much, as always. We should have called it Wordle of Wisdom, shouldn't we?
Wordle of Wisdom. Oh, I see what you've done there. If you were a cake, Kingsley, what would you be?
I don't know, an Eccles cake?
Of all the things I thought you'd say, Eccles cake is not. I'd sort of more of a Victoria sponge or something.
It's very revealing about how I'm seen.
Indeed. And thanks also to editor of Photography News, Mr. Will Idiot Chung. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, guys. And I'll try next episode not to sit on the fence so much, because the old splinters are a bit painful, I have to say.
Good stuff. Lovely to see you both. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll speak to you again before too long. Cheers.
The most important thing about bracketing is turning it off. So you don't go, why is this bloody picture so dark? Like next time you turn your camera on. I've always found. Anyway.
It's a good point. You should have mentioned that, Kingsley. It's a very good tip.